Penn Hill Group, and they are a leading bipartisan lobbying and consulting firm specializing in education and the workforce. And their work includes policy development, analysis and implementation, lobbying and government relations, strategic consulting, advocacy, research and due diligence, grant writing and support, and education policy updates. So they are more than able to talk to us today about policy and how it might relate to badges. And today's presenters include Danica Petrosius, who's the principal, and she's been leading the Badge Alliance Policy Working Group, Kara Machon, who's a vice president, and also Rich Stombries, who is also a vice president. And also thanks to Devin Parsons, who's been assisting with this webinar, as well as the Policy Working Group. And today's webinar is going to focus on Policy 101 and how it relates to open badges. And I'll just read a brief description that went out in order to announce the work. And educational institutions around the world are exploring open badges for teaching and learning. And policy is a broad area that can significantly impact badge uptake and effectiveness within post-secondary education and beyond. So that definitely applies to all of the people who are attending this call. It includes institutional legal obligations, rights, ownership, federal and state government requirements, and local government regulations. In this webinar, we will outline the importance of policy considerations for open badges and highlight important issues and areas for consideration, such as assessment, transcripting and publishing, intellectual property, privacy, and ethical and legal issues. So I would like to thank the Penn Hill Group for presenting this webinar. We're really excited, and we'll be recording it. And then we will, they'll present the work, their presentation, and then we'll entertain questions. And thank you very much, and let's get underway.
Great, thank you. Well, we're excited to be here, and we've been really excited to be part of the Policy Working Group effort to create some policy principles around the opportunities for badges in federal policy. We'll get to, at the end of the webinar, we'll talk more specifically about those, but in creating those principles, it became very clear that, you know, this evolution of where the work on badges is across the country and the world is moving, and policy is going to start moving in the federal context next year. We expect a lot of activity. And so one of the things that now that there's some structure to the policy ideas and principles around badges, and that you've all created, and then that there's potentially a lot of activity next year in the federal space around these related issues, it was important for everybody to get a good baseline landscape of where the issues stand. Any one of the topics we talk about today could be a webinar of their own. And so we're just going to hit the highlights, and there's opportunities to ask questions, or if people want to reach out to us with specific questions in the future, we're happy to answer them. But hopefully this will at least give some context and landscape setting as we move forward. The first sort of piece is a lot of this is focused on the education space, or the related education and learning space around the badge ideas. But when you think of that, across the federal government, there are some very major players that would have a stake in policy that relates to all of this work. Obviously, the U.S. Congress and the House of Representatives, the Senate, obviously the White House, but also we're looking at specific agencies that are playing more and more in these areas. Department of Education, U.S. Department of Labor, Federal Communications Commission, Federal Trade Commission. There could be other areas that also end up in the future, but these are the main ones. And so when you look at the landscape moving forward, you'll hear a lot about them. But also, if one were to be putting together some sort of advocacy strategy, you'd want to make sure that you at least understood where each of these players were generally and what the levers were within them. And then we think not just about who the players are, but broadly think about the categories that we think about affecting badges, whether badges are part of workforce, K-12, or higher education. We think of some major pieces: competency-based education, personalized learning, learning and career pathways, which can play out in a lot of different spaces. Obviously, workforce and industry-based credentialing, generally the issues of our technology and internet safety and privacy infrastructures that are so critical to the baseline of any of this happening, and how those move forward or don't. And so that's kind of the broad sweep and a big picture of a lot of things we're going to touch on today. I want to mention too, before I turn it over to some of my colleagues, that one of the reasons we're all here today is because at the table of presenters, Rich, Kara, and I, each of us have had over 10 years at least experience in Congress, and I also in the administration. So you're hearing from people who've worked on these laws in some of these places. Kara actually having worked both in the House and the Senate, Rich having worked in the House but on the Republican side, Kara and I on the Democrat side. So just to give you a sense of perspective, we're going to try to weave in some of those perspectives as appropriate to this, so you really get a sense of the landscape. Rich?
So now we'll talk about the overview, kind of the federal role in K-12 education, and these are generalizations. There's exceptions to everything in Washington, but generally this is how we kind of see the appropriate kind of federal role under these various issues. For K-12 elementary and secondary education, education is primarily a state and local responsibility. Members on both sides of the aisle, especially now with this this recent election, the idea is that the federal government kind of provides some money, and then the states use that money with their authority to kind of implement programs from the state and local level. I just wanted to kind of point that out a little bit, because that is increasing more and more. If you hear folks talking about education policy from the federal level, one of the first things you hear is that it's got to be a state and or a local responsibility. With regard to funding, the feds only provide about 10% of elementary and secondary education funding that states and localities use. So funding-wise or money-wise, it's not a huge investment when you compare the overall budget that's being spent at the state and local level on education. But what you do find is that even though there are fewer dollars, or not as many dollars as you might think, the influence that the federal government has is immense. You know, we put here on this slide that it's substantial. That is very, I think that's the low bar. I think that there's significant, substantial, overarching influence that the feds have. Part of that is because the state and local municipalities have been so starved for money in the past that they go after money or accept money wherever it's coming from, kind of regardless of the issues or the accountability or things of that nature. They're so starved for money that they go after money. So you see significant influence even though the dollars may not be there. The other kind of role in federal education is that the federal government, the idea is that the focus is on kids that are disadvantaged. Generally, it's financially disadvantaged. And there was a shift in that during kind of the debate on No Child Left Behind with Speaker Boehner, who was the chairman of the committee at the time, really focusing on poverty as to where this money should go. So you've got a state and local responsibility. The feds only provide a little bit of money. They have a lot of influence, and most of this money is going to poor kids. With regard to the federal role in higher education, the federal influence here is significant because the federal government provides funding for kids to go to school. Pell Grants, other financial assistance, student loans. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Interestingly, in the higher ed community, there's less control, I think, or maybe less influence over these policies than you see in the K-12 sector, so it's a little different. The other role that we wanted to talk about was early education, early childhood education. You hear a lot about that most recently out of the Obama administration. It's been one of the platforms that they've kind of been focused on. But you've got a whole patchwork of systems in early childhood that range from Head Start to the community child care development block grant, where parents are able to access government funding to seek child care. Moving on from the role into actual legislation. So the legislation is what helps the administration implement their roles in various policies. So for elementary and secondary education, you've got the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was last reauthorized as the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001, and when it is reauthorized again at some point, it will have a different name, but the underlying statute is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Title I is the biggest program there. It's a formula grant that goes out to states based, essentially, overly simplified, on the number of poor kids that they have so they can get some extra help and services. With higher education, the Higher Education Act is the primary statute. It was begun under 1965 as part of President Johnson's Great Society agenda. As we mentioned before, this includes Pell Grants and other financial assistance that help students get into school. A couple of other bills that are core pieces of legislation under the Department of Education: the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. This is legislation that is focused on students with disabilities, students with special learning needs. There is a great cost for states and local agencies to educate students with special needs and with disabilities. The intent overall of IDEA is to have the federal government provide some additional funding to help with the extra costs that are associated with educating children with disabilities and special needs. Another kind of primary, and this covers another area, career and technical education, the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. Goes by a couple of different names depending on when you're looking at it. Back in the day, it used to be called vocational education. Now it's career and technical education, but it's the education from the academic as well as vocational that can help folks get the learning they need to go into a career and or higher education.
And real quickly, this is Donica again. One of the reasons we're running through all of these bills at a very high level is when we start to tie it back to badges, it's important to understand that the way Congress and the administration work is any vehicle, we call a piece of legislation or law a vehicle because it moves forward through the process of policy making, is an opportunity or potential need to play defense for badges or for any education-related or learning-related policy. So it's important to understand sort of the baseline of all of these places that you might see, for example, privacy issues come up or funding issues come up or opportunities to advance competency-based, which then is an opportunity to advance badges. So contextually, that's why we're running through this. It's important to understand how many opportunities and then the breadth of content that's in them.
Great. So I will pick up then with another core education bill, and that's the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, or also called FERPA. This began in 1974, and it's really one of the biggest pieces of legislation that controls how much personally identifiable information can be shared for students, and it's really based on their educational records. So this really refers to, it's both K through 12 and higher education, and it's how much information is released on students and also the parents' rights over that information. Interestingly, this bill has had a lot of action recently, not too many changes, but a lot of action and a lot of conversations, and that will affect, as Donica said, kind of how badges can be used in the future, and there is a potential for people to weigh in on badges with the FERPA debate. There's been a lot of guidance coming out of the Department of Education, clarifying the role that industry has in FERPA, clarifying what best practices are for the use of software, mobile apps, and web-based tools. Also parents' rights under FERPA. And then interestingly, industry has also kind of played a big role on the FERPA conversation, and they've recently released a pledge on how they plan to address student privacy data collection. And that pledge was actually, it's been signed on to by a number of different industry, and it is It's not legally binding. However, it is something that industry can be held to in the future. And building off of that, Congress has also started to get into the mix on all of this, looking at making amendments to FERPA, introducing new legislation that would amend FERPA. Some of the main players on that are Congressman Klein and Senator Alexander. Those are both the chairman of the House Education and Workforce Committee and the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Also, Congressman Polis and Congressman Messer have been big players on that and actually helped kind of lead industry to that pledge that I mentioned earlier. So this is a bill that we're going to see more action on in the coming Congress, and one that we should take a careful look at. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about how education bills relate to badges, continuing that conversation on competency-based education. This is an issue that is probably not new at the state and local level, but in federal policy, it is new, talking about how it's going to fit into both the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Higher Education Act. Competency-based education, for those who don't know, is basically learning anytime, anywhere, at any pace, and getting credit for that learning, connecting learning that happens outside of the classroom to learning that happens in the classroom, and building in that those hands-on activities. And badges are a great fit for competency-based education because they're able to capture and convey the learning that happens anywhere at any time. So there has been talk in Congress about this. There was a pilot in the Senate Elementary and Secondary Education Act. In terms of education, the department has put out guidance on how to connect and count direct assessment, which is when you have competency-based learning, getting actually the financial aid for that connected. And I think there'll be more talk of this in the future. It's going to be an interesting conversation. It's been easier to kind of picture competency-based at the higher education level. It'll be interesting as we talk about Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization, how it's going to fit into new conversations on accountability. And then also wanted to talk a little bit about student data and privacy. This is another big issue central to badges. Obviously, badge systems need to collect data for learning across networks. And so, as I discussed earlier, FERPA has been a big conversation. I think COPPA as well, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Those conversations really relate to badges and how data can safely be collected for students. So that's another issue to kind of keep your eye on as it's moving forward. And then switching from education to labor, we wanted to talk a little bit about core labor bills, one of which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. This funds job training and adult education programs. It also has Job Corps, which is free education and employment training for youth ages 16 to 24. And we wanted to tell you a little bit about how badges connect to labor and workforce career pathways. So badges can help learners create and navigate pathways that are driven by their interests and connected to college and career-related goals. And again, we think there's been a lot of conversation around badges in the career pathways and learning pathways space, which is great. In the recent WIA bill, or now it's called out WIA, I guess.
WIA.
Yeah. So there was some legislation on post-secondary education credentials. And in that, they do reference industry-recognized certificates or certifications that are portable and stackable. And the fact that that language highlights portability and the ability to stack credentials, it opens the door for badges. And it's something that, as they make regulations on the new WIA bill, that we should be following carefully. And then we're going to move now to the FCC and core Federal Communications Commission bills. one of which is E-rate, and this is from the Telecommunications Act of 1996. It's also known as the Schools and Libraries Program, and this provides funding for connectivity for schools. And obviously, in terms of badges, you need a strong infrastructure within schools in order to use the technology appropriately. And this also has had some recent action by the FCC. In August 2014, the FCC released an E-rate modernization order to expand access to funding. And then just recently in November, the FCC announced intent to raise the funding cap for E-rate by about $1.5 billion, from $2.4 billion to $3.9 billion, and that has been a very, all of E-rate modernization has been somewhat controversial and will continue to be discussed as in the next Congress and as FCC sees fit. Then we're going to move to the for Federal Trade Commission bill, and that I mentioned a little bit earlier is COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act. This law was passed in 2000, and it governs the participation of young children in online activities. And this basically has to do with children who are ages 13 and under. It requires a website provider to obtain verifiable consent from a parent or guardian for the participation of any child under age 13. This again plays into badges as you're thinking about who is earning a badge, who the learner is. If the learner is under age 13, are you compliant with COPPA? How do you collect that data? How do you do it where the student still has access to the benefits of badges, but you're within the confines of the law? So that is another issue. I know for those who participate in cities of learning and have worked on that with badges, that's a big issue that you have been grappling with. And there are some efforts in Congress to amend COPPA. Some of those efforts are tweaking the age. Should it be 13? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? Some people are also in the field thinking about how do you even rethink COPPA altogether. Age is not necessarily the best way to go, so how do you continue to provide protections to children but allow that freedom for students to navigate, to learn, to have agency with technology and the internet. So I've said a lot about bills being reauthorized, so it's probably helpful if we tell you what reauthorization actually is. When Congress passes a bill and the President signs it into law, it's usually only authorized temporarily. So there'll be a date by which the bill needs reauthorization. And reauthorization is when Congress passes the bill, again, with changes or amendments, we call them. They could add or delete programs and change the provisions under the law. And unfortunately, in recent Congresses, few education bills have been fully reauthorized, but they do remain funded through the appropriations process, and so it's not as if the law just stops. It continues to apply, and that can be a good or bad thing at times. So some of the reauthorization delays are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Sorry, we have a typo there. And that was due for reauthorization in 2007. So we have been waiting for a very long time to reauthorize that bill. There has been multiple efforts in recent Congresses to make that happen. They have stalled either in the House or Senate, or have passed both the House and Senate but never went to conference. So that will be another bill that is talked about in this next Congress. The other bill is the Education Sciences Reform Act, or ESRA. That was last authorized in 2000, or I'm sorry, that was up for reauthorization in 2008. We have here that it's likely to be reauthorized in 2014. We're still working on that. Not quite sure if that will actually happen. Hopefully, but you know, with all of these bills, it takes both the House and the Senate to pass, and then through conference or ping-ponging a bill back and forth to actually have it signed into law, and it can stall at any one of those points. and unfortunately Ezra has been stalled. Then the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Rich had mentioned that earlier, that Part B has been permanently authorized, and Parts C and D were up for reauthorization in 2010. Rich also spoke about Career and Technical Education Act. That is up for reauthorization, was up for reauthorization in 2012. There is some talk of moving forward with that, but it looks like they want to clear the decks with ESEA and higher education prior to actually getting to CTE. Head Start Act, that was up for reauthorization in 2012, and then there's the Higher Education Act, and that is up now in 2014, and there is talk, as I think Rich mentioned, on moving forward with reauthorization there.
And even when we have all these sort of what you call stalled reauthorizations, a couple things to know. One is that when these things are sort of what we call the reauthorizations do, they don't just stop happening. As long as the programs in those laws are funded through the appropriations process, those laws continue. So that's why you see these long delays. But even with these long delays, we have seen two pieces of legislation move to get signed into law this year. One was the Child Care Development Block Grant and the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act. And I think for us, that just shows that even in a very difficult political environment, these kinds of things can move. And as advocates, you have to be very vigilant and look for opportunities even when the political climate seems very messy.
Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the federal budget process, which changes. It could be changing as we're doing this this webinar now. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the way it's laid out and it's supposed to go, and then we can talk a little bit about kind of how it's happening. Generally, what happens is the president submits a budget request to fund the government early on in the year for Congress to take a look at and review. Then Congress takes up these appropriations bills that we've been talking about. They have 12 spending bills that are divided over various appropriations committees and subcommittees, and these committees actually cut the checks for government services. So you've got the budget request that comes in, Congress takes a look at that, works with the administration, doesn't work with the administration, they come up with their plan, they pass these budget bills, the House and the Senate conference, they send something over to the president, and the president signs or vetoes the bills. That's kind of generally how you learned about it in Schoolhouse Rock. It really hasn't been happening that way over the past several years for a number of different reasons. You'll see on this slide that this year the budget request came up a little late. And to be honest with you, the appropriators haven't been able to move legislation through chambers. So the appropriations work is just not getting done in a regular order or regular manner. So as a result, what we have in recent years is we have a lot of either omnibus bills, which is when you group a lot of government agency programming together and pass it as one gigantic bill, or we go through a process which we call a continuing resolution, which is essentially just extending the valid dates, if you will, of government funding. So if government funding is supposed to run out at the end of the fiscal year, you use a continuing resolution to continue things as they are. That's generally, you can make changes under a continuing resolution, but not generally. They just continue funding. So where we're at right now, in early December, is we are operating under a continuing resolution that is going to run through December 11th. The Congress must send legislation to the president that he must sign before December 11th to keep the government open. If it doesn't, that's when you have a shutdown. So there's lots of talk in the news now about, is there going to be a shutdown? Do the Republicans want to shut down the government? Something proactive has to happen before December 11th, either a continuing resolution or some other mix of funding for the federal government, which could be an omnibus bill or various appropriations bills. Those have to be updated before December 11th to kind of continue what's going on. A little bit about the makeup of the 114th Congress. Republicans increased their majority in the House of Representatives. Interestingly, they have the largest majority since 1928. So what that means for the speaker is that, I think this is actually a question, is does he have a large enough Republican majority to move things even though he may not have his entire Republican conference on board? You've got conservatives who have differing views with some of the other moderates and conservative Republicans in the conference. So the increase in the number of members is being described as a way or as an opportunity for Speaker Boehner to have a little more flexibility in trying to move things that may not have broad or unanimous consensus under his conference. But it's still not carte blanche. He doesn't have a veto-proof majority. The Republicans can't do whatever they want all the time in the House, but there is, greater Republican majorities. On the Senate side, there's also been a changeover. Some of the races are not done as of yet, but the Republicans will have the majority in the Senate, which means that you're going to have a changeover in leadership. In the Senate, while the majority is not as important as it is in the House. In the House, the majority completely rules and controls the agenda. In the Senate, you essentially have to have 60 votes to make things happen. And what are the Republicans are 53 or 54 now, I think, with one of the races called, but there's still one or two outstanding. You still have to have bipartisan support to kind of move something in the Senate. So the change there is, yes, the Republicans will be chair and driving the agenda more, but you still aren't really going to be able to move anything unless you kind of have bipartisan support. That kind of leads into this next slide about the changed Congress. And, what does this mean for now? We're going to see some significant change in leadership in both the House and Senate. With the Senate changeover, you're going to have new people in the majority running the show in leadership. On the House side, you've got, for the most part, folks that are staying the same, but you've got some new folks that are coming into leadership because of the loss of the majority leader in his primary election, Eric Cantor. So there are some new faces. The administration is still run by President Obama, a Democrat, so you've got a powerful branch of government that's Democrat and a powerful branch of government that is Republican, and the big question is how's that all going to come together, and what does it mean? What we've seen kind of in past years with this gridlock or the inability to kind of get things done is that policy gets implemented not through the ways that we've been describing. It's not done in a regular way. It's kind of done differently through different vehicles, and that is something that's a little difficult to get a hold on as well as these things change.
And I've coined this phrase, policy by mischief. And the reason I say that is because we've talked a lot about Congress, and Congress has a regular order, and then Congress has ways that it can do things around that regular order. The administration is the same way. And this administration, the Obama administration, has been taking immense executive authority to get things done, partially because Congress wasn't doing a lot and they want to move ahead, and partially it's a new day. It's a new way of doing business. We don't know how long it will last for the next president or the next, but for right now, it's been massive. And some of the things, so for example, let's give you a few examples. So the ESEA, or No Child Left Behind Act, after its long stay, needed to be reauthorized. Congress didn't do it, so the administration came in and said, I'm hearing complaints across the country that this isn't the way it should be now, and we're going to change it. They just did that without Congress, and they did something called waivers. They provided states with an immense amount of flexibility with some strings attached to basically change the law outside of the regular legislative process. Some people think that's wrong because sort of the people's input, the people of the world, of the country's input into that was minimal, and theoretically the congressional process is where the people's input gets put in. But on the other hand, when Congress isn't doing anything and people are complaining, some people are saying this is what was needed. In either case, around one of the reasons that's fueling the Republicans' desire to make education, ESEA, and higher ed top priority next year is not just a call for changes and the need to do better, but that the administration has single-handedly been changing higher education and elementary and secondary education at the federal level unilaterally, and it's time for them to put their own imprint on it too. The administration has also taken, in addition to sort of regulatory changes, it has also taken the opportunity to work very hard on initiatives. So there's another way the administration has been pushing through is just to create new sort of initiatives, some of which may or may not get funded, but they certainly drive a conversation. One of the big initiatives related to our work here is Connect Ed, which both really fueled and pushed in some ways the FCC to really get to these E-rate changes that they had and are potentially about to do. It's also driven a lot of conversation in industry about how they can help the administration do their own partnering to advance digital assets in learning. And it also fueled the big data report, which most of you have probably seen that the White House put out across, learning was one piece of it, but recognizing that data and privacy issues are front and center across the board more than they've ever been if the White House is taking such an initiative front and center on that. They've also taken a really major approach to just through the funding appropriations processes, getting money to do some what they call innovation pieces. So the Investing in Education and Innovation Fund called I3 and Race to the Top were two signature programs that they pushed through in their early days, and then they've continued to be funded, both K-12 and early education, that are really programs that they created the idea, they got some money for them with very minimal legislative language, and then they've just been basically writing how those programs get implemented by themselves. Same is true of college affordability, a major tenet of what the administration's been pushing. And they're proposing a college rating system that potentially will go through a regulatory process soon. They've also been regulating on gainful employment and other things, as well as proposing some pots of innovation money for community colleges and others. So there's been a lot of activity in their initiative end. And I say all that because while to some people that seems like tyrannical takeover of federal education policy, it's also an opportunity. The administration is not going to change their efforts to sort of take these initiatives or do new initiatives where they can, and if there's an opportunity around badges policy for door opening in some of these areas, this kind of vehicle, which is quote, sort of is the administration's set of vehicles, their executive powers that they can spend or use, is a potential way to start to open the doors. It doesn't always have to be the legislative process. And as we look later to the principles, a lot of the trends that we're seeing as people talk about federal policy and learning, there so much of these trends. These are trends we've created because we're talking to you about badges, but I can honestly say these things are all happening regardless if you were talking about badges. And the interesting part is badges and all the related work around badges could fit perfectly into this. And that is meaning that the stage is set in a way that there is real potential for policy action around these issues. So advancing early education and care, there's so much about certification and teacher work within that context that is ripe for these kinds of conversations. Obviously, with higher ed and competency-based happening and career readiness, there's all kinds of activity. A lot of that activity around what does it mean to hold schools or individuals accountable for prior programs, and what does the evidence you show? People are looking for new and different ways to show evidence that aren't just standardized test scores. Expanded learning, summer and after school programs continue to be a core part of what the conversation is in K-12 in particular. There's been a surge. We went from almost $3 billion when President Clinton left the presidency. There was almost $3 billion being spent on education technology in the Department of Education alone. As of right now, again, not counting the E-rate, it's about $27 million. All of a sudden, in about the last 2 years, we've seen this uptick in interest in funding and advancing and pushing forward digital learning, blended learning, personalized, new technology, people call it different things. And the Connect Ed is just what that we talked about before is one of those things. Within that, you get a lot of talk, though, about student privacy, and that talk is very complicated, and it's not, you know, a lot of it has to do with the fears of clamping down on privacy, and more technology means more access to data that's going to hurt my kids. But on the other hand, there's a lot of talk about what is the right balance between privacy and data and learning, and how could we advance that. It is by no means, it is an active and moving policy area, but it's not a solidified one. There is also, and a huge area for this, is what does it mean to all the places people learn, how do we capture that, and how do we care about that, and how do we measure that, and not only how we measure it, but can we make more kinds of learning count? And so that is an obvious place for this work. And the only one that we listed here that I touched on a little bit, but even I'd say in the last 4 months, is just exploding, is the anti-testing movement. People are suddenly, what was just kind of a fringe issue, or, you know, people might roll their eyes and say, of course, everyone complains about tests, has suddenly become an issue where people are saying, okay, we want to change what we're doing in terms of federal testing. It doesn't mean all federally mandated testing is going to go away, the current structure. Does mean there's going to be a lot of conversation about it. But what that means for us to think about is that, does that mean that all assessment is bad? No. Are there opportunities to offer different ways of looking at assessments, different ways of using assessments? Yes. So as we look forward, we've mentioned a little bit of this in the next Congress. We have so far, the folks that talk about education the most are really focused on ESEA and higher education moving. That is ripe with opportunities. We'll talk about the principles in a minute for activity in these areas. And it's right now that they're really saying, especially in the Senate, that they want to try to, as Rich mentioned, they want to try to work together and do some bipartisan things. It's going to be hard. The context is very difficult. It's about fewer requirements and more flexibility, so it's harder to get ideas in there. But for our kind of work, more flexibility also opens doors for innovation and different ways of doing business. So we'll be thinking a lot about how that works together. And then, you know, just as a very top line, and some of this might be very obvious, but we try to remind people when we talk to folks as they're thinking about how do we advance our work. Advancing work doesn't always mean advancing work. We think federal policy is really important because you have to recognize, like Rich said, while it doesn't always seem like it's the biggest imprint, often states are doing more, and privacy, we're seeing states do a ton. It is a huge one, and it's often a standard bearer, or a, like if the winds are blowing this way here, they're coming everywhere. And so it's really important to pay attention to it. And then it's really important to understand that you have to pay attention to it, because a few words in a piece of legislation can stop every opportunity for you to do your work. So if somehow they've clamped down so much that you could never have data sharing in agreements in this kind of work, you couldn't do any kind of badges with schools. It'd just be done. So there's a need to really understand the work and to try to influence it appropriately, and then to also always be thinking about offense and defense as you're trying to address your what it is you want to accomplish. And again, in the spirit of a 101 thing, we really do believe that if you're interested in sort of choosing some principle, or if you're interested in trying to move forward and advocate around competency-based education, or any of the ideas that we'll share with you in a few minutes, when you create an advocacy strategy, you really need some key pieces to be in place. You need to have a clear policy platform, which the Badge Alliance Working Group has a great job of making a great start of. Secondly, you need a really strong rationale and data. There's a lot of work done by the Badge Alliance and other partners broadly that provides that. You need knowledgeable messengers. You all are extremely knowledgeable messengers, and the partners you work with, the service providers, are also great and knowledgeable messengers too as you deliver your messages. And then when you get down the road, if you do engage in any of this, you also, we call strategic nimbleness. You know, if a legislative process stalls, it's not over. Maybe there's an executive branch type of activity that we could do. So, and we've already talked about the broad sort of notions of strategies that you would incorporate into that as you move forward. So very quickly, to end this and see if there's any questions, we wanted to just briefly run through, for those of you who aren't familiar with our policy principles that the Policy Working Group created, is, and this there is on the website, on the Badge Alliance website at the policy section, there is the full document that, you know, frankly is never a done document. We would love to have, if any of you look at this and think we're missing something or something's off, please let us know. What we've done here is just identified the top line 9 pieces that we identified as the major policy principles. In the fuller document, there's more substantive support for each of those aligned. But one is, you know, and the reason to do principles is to really understand what are the hooks and levers that we think are more important that would advance badges and work around badges, or things that we need to really be watchful of to not allow it to stop that work. So one is obviously, in the spirit of innovation, innovation policy opens doors for badges, or assessments, there's no question. The whole movement towards student-centered learning and how we can capture that is a great hook for us. Partnerships, you know, the idea that schools alone, whether it's higher ed institutions or it's K-12 institutions, they're no longer the only players in learning, and how do we make sure to maximize for the student at whatever age they are learning opportunities. Digital literacy, all of this assumes, these infrastructures assumes that we have a digitally literate society that can make good decisions online and that can work on a variety of levels and interact online and offline sort of seamlessly. We don't have that. And so, you know, when continuing to think about how we advance principles around digital literacy and not forgetting that core literacy that we want to see everybody have. Another one is trusted environments. Some of you are familiar with the Aspen Task Force that's really made this a really prominent piece of work, as well as the digital media and learning competition out of the hub there. But trusted environments, you know, a lot of talk that I talked earlier about is this reactionary notion that, you know, somebody stole our data, we need to clamp down. And I think there's an interest in trying to have a dialogue be more about, we do want to protect data, but we also want people to use data appropriately and to own their data and own their online participation. And so it's not about clamping down, but it's how do you create these trusted environments where everybody feels like they're getting what they need out of the system. It's hard, and there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of lack of knowledge, but advancing that dialogue is very important. Equity of access, obviously there's nothing digital without digital access, and so that's an ongoing sort of standard bearer we have to continue to push forward on. Generally standards, particularly around institutions of higher ed, and to connect better institutions of higher ed with actual job performance or job opportunities is an ongoing conversation that we want to be part of. And promoting lifelong learning is critical. You know, whether your formal education stops at K-12 or some portion of higher ed or after, badges are just such a great tool for forever engaging in learning. And then civic engagement is a critical, and digital citizenship is a critical piece of another lever in policy that we can take advantage of. So as we think, that's again the broad overview of the principles. As we think about what this means for all of you and what you can do if you're interested in any of this, I think for us, like I mentioned, we'd really love for anybody who hasn't already to review the badge's policy principles, and look at it both to see if it's right, but also, do any of these seem like they really would help or hurt your work in the sense of playing offense or defense? And something, no advocate advocates for everything. Usually we find things that are most salient for your work and your interests. And so to the extent that any of those speak to you, we invite people to take those and run with them, to find other partners that want to work together and to advocate around them, or to provide us or the Badge Alliance suggestions about what might happen in the future. But this is really to provide both the policy principles and this webinar are to help provide a landscape that anybody can jump from going forward. We have some time for questions, and Devin is going to help us through that.
Yeah. So we've already received a couple of comments and questions from the audience, and I know Sunny Lee is also on the line from Badge Alliance, but I will read those off. The first is a comment from Cable Green of Creative Commons, and he noted that open educational resources could be on the trends list. Anything further to discuss?
No, that's a great idea.
Great. And then we also have a question from Amy Ferguson. Is anything from today's White House College Opportunity Day of Action expected to impact open badges?
I think that there's probably a short and long answer to that. So the short answer, or maybe I'm mixing the two, but basically today is about the president kind of highlighting his past actions to increase college opportunity and talking about what networks of colleges and universities are doing now and in the future to increase opportunity. So some of that is just generally about increasing the number of career-ready college graduates. Talking about producing more college graduates who are career-ready, setting goals and defining plans to help them reach those goals, enhancing college readiness, which talks about, connecting with high schools and making sure that community colleges are also in the mix. They're talking about improving access to highly trained school counselors and strengthening STEM education. While there's not a specific mention of open badges that I have heard, these are all opportunities for you within the badge system, especially when you're talking about those connections between high schools, community colleges, four-year colleges, and the workforce, because you're still, again, it's that competency-based education aspect where you're connecting the learning that happens anytime, anywhere, at any pace. And we do know that, for non-traditional students and traditional students, but particularly non-traditional students, you are faced with the high cost of college and your time constraints. If you are a single parent or you are working full-time and trying to balance, college, those opportunities to use the learning that's happening in the real world and connect it to a credit-bearing experience are essential. So I think those are things that are worth exploring with badges and are currently being explored with many of you who are doing badges. So even if the specific words, open badge systems, are not used in this call to action, it is yet another opportunity for you guys to get involved and to kind of push the open badge system out there.
And part of what the Badge Alliance, I shouldn't speak for them, but part of the Badge Alliance that, at least that I see the benefit, is that it's starting to raise the profile. And if you would hope that both from an advocacy point of view, it's starting to get into the policy discussion if folks do, and then just from over time, that you would expect if that same summit happened in 5 years from now, that it would be an obvious, if not forefront, piece of it. I think we're still in an emerging space in DC, although with lots of opportunity.
I also see that we've got a question about where to find the principles. I know we have sent the link out, but just to say it verbally, it's at www.badgealliance.org/policy. And also this webinar and the PowerPoint will be available as well. All right, I don't think we have any more questions, so thank you all for joining us today. This will be a resource for your reference further, and we're happy to answer any follow-up questions you have.
Thank you.
Oh, and I just see that people can follow this on @OpenBadges on Twitter if you want to see the ongoing conversation.